There are names in the galaxy that echo like quiet songs, names that carry weight not because of crowns or empires, but because of the lives they touched, the burdens they carried, and the sacrifices they made. And among them stands Obi-Wan Kenobi, remembered in whispers as General Kenobi, in reverence as Master Kenobi, and in secrecy as Ben, the hermit of the desert. His story is not simply one of lightsabers clashing in brilliance or battles carved across stars, but a story of duty, loss, hope, and endurance, of a man caught between the ideals of peace and the endless demands of war, who lived not for himself, but for the fragile thread of balance in a galaxy always teetering on the edge of collapse. When we look back at Obi-Wan's life, we see not just a warrior, but a boy taken from his home to train as a Jedi on distant Coruscant, a young Padawan following the steps of his master Qui-Gon Jinn, a reluctant mentor forced to raise the Chosen One, a general leading clone armies in a war the Jedi never sought, a brother who watched his dearest friend fall into darkness, and an old guardian who lived in exile to protect a child who would one day bring light to the galaxy. His tale stretches across decades, intertwining with the rise and fall of the Republic, the birth of the Empire, and the slow, flickering survival of hope when all seemed lost. There are names in the galaxy that echo like quiet songs, names that carry weight not because of crowns or empires, but because of the lives they touched, the burdens they carried, and the sacrifices they made. And among them stands Obi-Wan Kenobi, remembered in whispers as General Kenobi, in reverence as Master Kenobi, and in secrecy as Ben, the hermit of the desert. His story is not simply one of lightsabers clashing in brilliance or battles carved across stars, but a story of duty, loss, hope, and endurance, of a man caught between the ideals of peace and the endless demands of war, who lived not for himself, but for the fragile thread of balance in a galaxy always teetering on the edge of collapse. There are names in the galaxy that echo like quiet songs, names that carry weight not because of crowns or empires, but because of the lives they touched, the burdens they carried, and the sacrifices they made. And among them stands Obi-Wan Kenobi, remembered in whispers as General Kenobi, in reverence as Master Kenobi, and in secrecy as Ben, the hermit of the desert. His story is not simply one of lightsabers clashing in brilliance or battles carved across stars, but a story of duty, loss, hope, and endurance, of a man caught between the ideals of peace and the endless demands of war, who lived not for himself, but for the fragile thread of balance in a galaxy always teetering on the edge of collapse. When we look back at Obi-Wan's life, we see not just a warrior, but a boy taken from his home to train as a Jedi on distant Coruscant, a young Padawan following the steps of his master Qui-Gon Jinn, a reluctant mentor forced to raise the Chosen One, a general leading clone armies in a war the Jedi never sought, a brother who watched his dearest friend fall into darkness, and an old guardian who lived in exile to protect a child who would one day bring light to the galaxy. His tale stretches across decades, intertwining with the rise and fall of the Republic, the birth of the Empire, and the slow, flickering survival of hope when all seemed lost. When we look back at Obi-Wan's life, we see not just a warrior, but a boy taken from his home to train as a Jedi on distant Coruscant, a young Padawan following the steps of his master Qui-Gon Jinn, a reluctant mentor forced to raise the Chosen One, a general leading clone armies in a war the Jedi never sought, a brother who watched his dearest friend fall into darkness, and an old guardian who lived in exile to protect a child who would one day bring light to the galaxy. His tale stretches across decades, intertwining with the rise and fall of the Republic, the birth of the Empire, and the slow, flickering survival of hope when all seemed lost. And it is told not with triumph, but with quiet resilience. For Obi-Wan was never the loudest voice, never the boldest leader, but always the one who stood when others fell, who carried on when all seemed broken, and who chose sacrifice again and again. To speak of Obi-Wan Kenobi is to speak of the Jedi Order itself, its glory and its ruin. For in him you see the discipline of the temple, the compassion that set him apart, and the flaws that blinded him to the shadows growing beside him. He is both legend and tragedy, remembered in campfire tales by clones who once followed him, in fearful whispers by stormtroopers who heard of the Jedi general who never surrendered, and in the stories told to a farm boy on Tatooine who only knew him as a strange old hermit. His life is a long road filled with victories that never felt like triumphs and losses that never stopped weighing upon him. And in the end, he became not just a man, but a symbol of endurance, of a flickering flame carried through storms, of the possibility that even in exile, even in despair, hope can be preserved for those who come after. Tonight, as we trace the entire story of Obi-Wan Kenobi, we will begin with his birth and childhood, follow him through the halls of the Jedi Temple, walk beside him in the Clone Wars, stand with him in heartbreak on the burning shores of Mustafar, sit in silence with him during his long years in exile, and finally watch him meet his end with calm acceptance aboard the Death Star. For his life is a thread that binds eras together, a bridge between the fall of the Jedi and the rise of the rebellion. And his journey is as much about the galaxy as it is about one man's burden. Let the story of Obi-Wan unfold like a quiet chronicle, not rushed, but gentle, not sharp, but soft, so that you may drift with it step by step through every season of his life, and perhaps come to understand why, when he was called the last of the Jedi, it was not a title of pride, but of sorrow, and yet also of unbroken resolve. Long before he was the general of the Clone Wars, before he was the mentor to Anakin Skywalker, before he was the old hermit known as Ben Kenobi, Obi-Wan was simply a child of Stujon, a small world far from the gleaming towers of Coruscant, a place of rolling hills, wind-swept plains, and modest villages where the Force whispered quietly in the patterns of life. It was there, in that quiet land, that Obi-Wan first opened his eyes, born into a family that would not keep him. For like so many touched by the Force, his fate was decided almost as soon as it began. And though little is remembered of his parents, legends tell us that they gave him freely to the Jedi, believing the boy was destined for something greater than an ordinary life on Stujon. For Obi-Wan himself, there would always be a distant ache, a feeling of something lost before he could name it. Yet even as a youngling, he carried himself with a strange balance of discipline and curiosity, a boy quick to learn, quick to adapt, but also quick to question the world around him. When he was taken to the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, still only a child, he was met by sights that overwhelmed him: endless halls lined with statues of Jedi long gone, training rooms filled with other children swinging practice sabers, the hum of lightsabers in duels between masters and apprentices, and above all the serene presence of the Jedi Council that seemed both comforting and terrifying to young eyes. Obi-Wan entered life as a Jedi with eagerness, but also uncertainty, for the rules were strict, the training harsh, and the life he had known on Stujon quickly became a memory slipping away. In the dormitories, among dozens of other younglings, he learned to rise early, to meditate before dawn, to let the Force flow through him as if it were breath itself, and though he longed at times for family, he found instead companionship in his peers and guidance from wise masters who shaped him with patience. Master Yoda himself oversaw the training of the younglings, and it was under that ancient gaze that Obi-Wan's earliest lessons were forged to trust in the Force, to act without fear, to serve without thought of self. Yet Obi-Wan was not without struggle, for though he excelled in lightsaber drills and showed a natural talent for focus, he sometimes questioned his own worth, fearing he was too rigid, too cautious, not bold enough compared to others who dreamed of adventure and heroism. But it was precisely that discipline, that quiet strength, that marked him for greater things. And in the temple he grew from boy to youngling, learning the history of the Jedi, the mysteries of the Force, the burden of compassion, and the delicate line between peacekeeper and warrior. His days were filled with endless repetition, practice sabers clashing in the training halls, hours spent in meditation chambers, afternoons devoted to the study of galactic history and diplomacy, evenings spent in whispered conversations with fellow initiates about what it meant to leave behind families they barely remembered. Obi-Wan, though young, absorbed it all with quiet determination, and though he would never speak much of Stujon, the simplicity of that lost world remained within him, a reminder of a life outside the temple walls, a thread that tied him to the galaxy beyond the Order. By the time he was ready to be chosen as a Padawan, Obi-Wan had already shown flashes of the Jedi he would one day become calm in demeanor, loyal to the code, steady in heart, yet beneath it all, a quiet yearning lingered, a yearning for guidance, for belonging, for someone to believe in him as more than another child of the Force. And so, the boy from Stujon, who once might have lived a simple life tending fields or walking the hills of his home, became instead a child of destiny, his path forever altered by the gift and the burden of the Force, a path that would carry him into greatness and tragedy alike. For in that first step, when he left Stujon behind, Obi-Wan Kenobi's long and winding story truly began. The story of a boy who would grow to bear the title of Jedi Knight, then General, then Exile, and finally Myth, remembered not for where he came from, but for what he carried with him through every shadow that followed. In the long corridors of the Jedi Temple, where light poured through high windows and the hum of training sabers echoed faintly, Obi-Wan grew into his new life, a child of Stujon no longer, but a child of the Order, shaped by a routine that became both comfort and challenge. Mornings began with meditation, sometimes under the watch of Master Yoda, whose presence both humbled and unsettled younglings, for the tiny master seemed to peer straight into the hearts of children and see the doubts they tried to hide. And for Obi-Wan, those doubts were real. Was he strong enough, wise enough, destined enough to belong here? Yet he persevered, channeling those questions into discipline, holding his saber steady in practice while others wavered, memorizing lessons with patience while others fidgeted, listening carefully where others dreamed too loudly. In the refectories, he learned to eat quickly, sharing tables with dozens of peers, laughing in brief moments before the next lesson began. In the training halls, he found himself excelling not because of raw power, but because of focus, never swinging wildly but always choosing his strikes carefully. His instructors noting that even at a young age, Obi-Wan fought not with anger or desperation, but with thought and control. The other younglings came from countless worlds, some from noble families, some from poverty, some, like Obi-Wan, from distant planets whose names were little known, and together they became brothers and sisters in discipline, bound not by blood, but by the code. And yet, even surrounded by so many, Obi-Wan often felt the shadow of solitude. the absence of family pressing quietly at the edges of his mind. At night, when the temple grew silent, he would sometimes gaze out across Coruscant's endless cityscape, lights stretching beyond sight, and wonder what his parents looked like, what Stujon's skies were like in the dusk, and whether they thought of him questions he was taught to release, yet questions that never fully left him. Over time, he came to understand that this longing was not weakness, but part of who he was, a seed of compassion that would one day shape how he viewed not only his friends, but his enemies. For though he was taught to let go of attachment, Obi-Wan never forgot the ache of leaving Stujon, and in that memory was the root of the empathy that would define him, the ability to see others not simply as allies or threats, but as people, carrying their own unseen losses. And so the boy from Stujon became the youngling of the temple, his life reshaped by duty, his heart reshaped by discipline, his destiny reshaped by the Force, each day pulling him further away from the hills of his birth world and deeper into the path that would one day make him not only a Jedi, but one of the most enduring figures in galactic history. When Obi-Wan Kenobi was chosen as a Padawan, his life shifted from the shared lessons of the younglings to the intimate, often challenging bond of master and apprentice, and fate placed him under the tutelage of Qui-Gon Jinn, a Jedi whose wisdom was as deep as his defiance of the Council was notorious. Their pairing was not one of perfect harmony, but of friction, the kind of relationship in which differences sharpen rather than dull, and it was in that sharpening that Obi-Wan's path as a Jedi truly began, for Qui-Gon was a maverick who believed in listening to the living Force in the moment, while Obi-Wan clung to the order, structure, and discipline drilled into him in the temple, and so their earliest days together were filled with quiet arguments, Qui-Gon urging patience with the universe, while Obi-Wan pressed for rules and guidance, the boy trying to prove himself worthy of the Jedi Code, and the man insisting that true wisdom lay beyond codes and doctrines. Their first missions carried them across the galaxy, from tense negotiations with planetary governors to escort duties for fragile trade convoys, and in each case Obi-Wan learned lessons not only in diplomacy and combat, but in how to temper his instincts, for Qui-Gon, though stern at times, always found moments to turn failure into growth, pausing to show Obi-Wan how compassion could matter more than victory, how listening could be stronger than striking, how sometimes saving a single life was worth more than forcing an entire treaty. Still, the young apprentice often bristled at this unorthodox approach, believing Qui-Gon's refusal to obey the Council risked arrogance. Yet beneath the disagreements their bond deepened, master and apprentice learning to trust one another even when they disagreed. In the training halls aboard starships or in the quiet between missions, Qui-Gon would spar with Obi-Wan, their sabers flashing in tight arcs, the master's calm patience frustrating the apprentice's eagerness, until Obi-Wan learned to hold himself steady, to breathe, to let his movements flow rather than force them. And it was here that his signature style, defensive, deliberate, unyielding, began to emerge. Qui-Gon, for all his unorthodoxy, taught Obi-Wan the value of resilience, the idea that the galaxy rarely moved in straight lines and that one must bend without breaking, a lesson that would serve Obi-Wan in every season of his life. Beyond combat, Qui-Gon spoke often of the prophecy of the Chosen One, a belief that would one day shape both of their destinies. And though Obi-Wan listened with respect, he doubted, preferring the certainty of what could be seen and measured over visions of what might come. Yet as he matured under Qui-Gon's guidance, Obi-Wan came to understand the deeper balance his master sought, that the Force was not a law to be followed, but a current to be trusted. And though he never embraced this view completely, he carried pieces of it within him, even when he later clashed with Anakin. Their travels forged Obi-Wan into a capable Jedi. Wise beyond his years, yet still humble enough to listen, a negotiator with the patience to endure endless disputes and the courage to draw his blade only when every other path had failed. By the time the Naboo crisis drew them into its tangled web, Obi-Wan had become not only a dutiful apprentice, but also, in many ways, a son to Qui-Gon, the bond between them unspoken yet unbreakable, a bond that would be tested in fire and sealed in tragedy. For though they had often disagreed, Obi-Wan's heart had been shaped by Qui-Gon's lessons, and it was this mixture of obedience and open-mindedness, discipline and compassion that would define him forever as a Jedi, even long after his master's voice was gone. In the end, Obi-Wan's years as Qui-Gon's Padawan were years of preparation, of growing pains and arguments, of wisdom shared in quiet moments, of scars earned in early missions, and of trust forged in the constant presence of a mentor who believed in him even when he doubted himself. And though he could not know it then, those years of guidance would echo through every step he took, every choice he made, every burden he carried. For Obi-Wan Kenobi was not simply born a Jedi, he was shaped, tested, and tempered by the hand of Qui-Gon Jinn, and the mark of that apprenticeship would remain upon him for the rest of his life. As the years of apprenticeship unfolded, Obi-Wan Kenobi's relationship with Qui-Gon Jinn grew into something layered and complex, neither a perfect harmony nor a constant clash, but a living bond that carried tension and warmth in equal measure. And this tension became the crucible in which Obi-Wan was shaped. On worlds scarred by civil war, Obi-Wan often found himself urging Qui-Gon to follow the Council's orders to the letter, believing that obedience was the surest path to success, while Qui-Gon would quietly deviate, choosing instead to follow the whispers of the living Force, stepping into unexpected opportunities that seemed reckless at first, but almost always revealed hidden wisdom. Obi-Wan sometimes bristled at this, convinced that his master's independence would one day lead to disaster. Yet he also marveled when those same instincts brought peace without bloodshed, or when Qui-Gon's compassion turned enemies into allies. For Obi-Wan, each mission was a lesson in humility, patience, and trust, whether infiltrating the stronghold of a corrupt noble on Koth-Lys, negotiating the release of hostages on Ord Cestus, or fending off raiders on backwater trade routes. He learned that the galaxy was rarely as neat and orderly as the Jedi Code suggested. Qui-Gon's influence was not simply in philosophy, but in the small details. The way he would pause before a fight to study an opponent's stance. The way he would let silence stretch in negotiations until the other side revealed more than they intended. The way he could stop to listen to the wind on a strange world and say that the Force was speaking through it. Obi-Wan, ever disciplined, struggled to loosen his grip on rules, but over time he began to see that his master's unpredictability was not chaos, but harmony with something greater, a flow that could not always be charted. Their bond was tested not only in debates, but in danger, for the galaxy often forced them into battles. Neither sought ambushes in darkened streets, standoffs with warlords, duels against rogue Force users who had abandoned the Order. In these moments, Obi-Wan's skill with a blade grew quickly, his form crisp and defensive, his movements calculated, his patience unyielding, while Qui-Gon's strikes carried a natural rhythm that flowed like water, heavy and deliberate, yet deceptively swift. Together, master and apprentice became a formidable pair, complementing each other in ways neither would admit. Obi-Wan's restraint anchoring Qui-Gon's instinct, Qui-Gon's vision softening Obi-Wan's rigidity. Yet, the most profound lessons came not in combat, but in quiet moments, a conversation over a campfire after a long mission, where Qui-Gon told stories of past apprentices and failures, or a late night on Coruscant, where Obi-Wan confessed his fear of not living up to the code, only to hear his master remind him that the code was a guide, not a chain. Though their disagreements never vanished, the bond of trust beneath them grew unshakable, and in that bond Obi-Wan found something he had long yearned for since leaving Stujon: a sense of belonging, a sense of family. Qui-Gon may have been stubborn, difficult, even frustrating at times, but to Obi-Wan he became not only teacher, but father, the anchor that steadied him in a galaxy of endless demands. By the time whispers of unrest reached Naboo, Obi-Wan was no longer the uncertain boy from the temple, but a Jedi Padawan, whose blade was steady, whose heart was loyal, and whose destiny, though still unseen, was already tied inseparably to his master. In those final years before the storm, Obi-Wan stood ready beside Qui-Gon, still learning, still questioning, still doubting at times, but above all still trusting, unaware that the greatest trial of his life was about to tear that bond away and leave him to carry its weight alone. The turning point in Obi-Wan Kenobi's early life as a Jedi arrived with the crisis on Naboo, a moment that would not only define his transition from Padawan to Knight, but also set the course of the galaxy itself. For when the Trade Federation, under secret manipulation from the Sith, blockaded the small world of Naboo, Obi-Wan and his master Qui-Gon Jinn were dispatched as ambassadors, instructed to negotiate a peaceful settlement. And though Obi-Wan trusted in the mission, he sensed unease from the beginning, remarking on the odd nature of being sent as peacekeepers when the situation already carried the air of war. Their arrival on the Federation ship quickly confirmed those doubts, for the Viceroy and his allies had no intention of diplomacy, instead launching an attempt to kill the Jedi, forcing Obi-Wan into sudden battle against waves of droids, his blue saber flashing with precision as he fought beside Qui-Gon in narrow corridors filled with smoke and blaster fire. The Padawan's training tested in the stark reality of betrayal. Escaping to Naboo's surface, they became entangled in the struggle of Queen Padme Amidala, who sought to free her people from occupation. And though Obi-Wan remained cautious, trusting in the Council's wisdom, he followed Qui-Gon's instincts as they protected the young queen, traveling through the swamps of Naboo with the unlikely company of Jar Jar Binks, and soon embarking on a desperate journey to seek allies beyond her world. It was during this detour on Tatooine that Obi-Wan's destiny shifted forever, though at the time he could not see it. For while he stayed behind aboard their ship, his master discovered a boy named Anakin Skywalker, a slave child strong with the Force, whose future would alter the fate of them all. When Qui-Gon introduced the boy to Obi-Wan, the Padawan's skepticism was immediate, for while he respected his master, he found it difficult to believe in prophecies, and saw only danger in training someone so old and so untested, a seed of doubt that would linger in him long after. Yet the mission pressed on, drawing them to Coruscant, where Queen Amidala pleaded with the Senate, and Qui-Gon challenged the Jedi Council with his belief that Anakin was the chosen one, a claim Obi-Wan struggled to reconcile. Watching as the Council refused to grant permission for the boy's training, leaving Qui-Gon defiant, and Obi-Wan caught between loyalty to his master and devotion to the code. But events moved swiftly, and soon they returned to Naboo to free the planet, rallying its people and the Gungans in a last stand against the Federation. And it was there, in the palace hangar, that Obi-Wan's life was forever altered by the emergence of a shadow thought long extinct Darth Maul, a Sith apprentice with crimson skin and burning eyes, whose double-bladed lightsaber ignited with a hiss that promised death. The duel that followed was unlike anything Obi-Wan had ever faced. The ferocity of Maul's strikes hammering against his blade, the rhythm of combat forcing him to draw upon every lesson Qui-Gon had ever taught. Yet it was clear the battle was a trial beyond training, a clash not just of warriors, but of destinies. As they fought through corridors and into vast chambers filled with humming energy fields, Obi-Wan felt the weight of history pressing upon him, the realization that the Sith, long thought gone, were real and dangerous, and that he and his master stood as the only line of defense. In the chaos of flashing blades, Qui-Gon fought Maul with calm determination. Yet, when the duel carried them into the reactor chamber, fate struck its cruelest blow, for in a moment of opening, Maul's saber pierced Qui-Gon's chest, and Obi-Wan, rushing forward too late, could only watch as his master collapsed, the bond between them torn apart in a heartbeat. Grief and fury surged through him as he engaged Maul alone, his strikes wild at first, fueled by pain, until discipline reclaimed him, and in that desperate clash he found within himself a strength he had never touched before, meeting Maul's aggression with patience, his defense turning into resolve, until at last he seized the final moment, severing the Sith in two and sending his body falling into the depths below. Kneeling by Qui-Gon's side, Obi-Wan heard his master's final plea to train the boy Anakin, to carry forward the destiny Qui-Gon had believed in so strongly, and though Obi-Wan's heart was shattered, he made the vow, promising to honor his master's dying wish, even if it meant setting aside his own doubts. Afterward, in the quiet that followed Naboo's liberation, Obi-Wan was knighted by the Council, recognized for his bravery and strength, yet the honor carried little joy, for his master was gone, and his future now bound to a boy he barely understood. When the Council reluctantly agreed to grant Anakin training, it was Obi-Wan who stepped into the role of teacher, not from certainty but from duty, carrying the weight of Qui-Gon's faith, even as he feared it might one day prove a terrible mistake. Thus, from the shadows of Naboo's victory emerged both triumph and tragedy, the rise of Obi-Wan as a Jedi Knight and the first steps of Anakin Skywalker into the Order, their fates now intertwined, their paths leading into storms neither could foresee. And for Obi-Wan, the memory of his master's fall would linger like an unhealed wound, a reminder that every victory carried loss, and that the life of a Jedi was never one of triumph, but of sacrifice. In the days following the Battle of Naboo, as celebrations echoed through the streets and the people rejoiced at their liberation, Obi-Wan Kenobi carried none of the joy, for while the world was freed, his own heart was burdened by the fresh wound of loss, the death of Qui-Gon Jinn casting a shadow that victory could not brighten. He had fought bravely, defeated an enemy thought impossible, and been elevated by the Council to the rank of Jedi Knight. Yet all of it felt hollow. For what good was recognition when the one who had shaped him was gone, the man who had guided him through every uncertainty, taken away in a moment of red light and fury? And yet Obi-Wan did not collapse beneath the grief, for duty steadied him, the same duty that had always anchored his cautious heart. And in his master's final request to train Anakin Skywalker, he found not comfort, but purpose, a purpose that would shape the rest of his life. Obi-Wan had doubted the boy from the beginning, seeing not prophecy but danger in his age, his attachment, his fierce will. And yet Qui-Gon's conviction had been unshakable. And in that dying wish, Obi-Wan saw no choice but to honor the man who had been his guide, his father, his anchor. So when he stood before the council, he argued not only with formality, but with determination, insisting that he would train Anakin regardless of their doubts, his voice steady though inside he was uncertain. And in that moment, he revealed a quiet defiance that mirrored his master. Though Obi-Wan never realized it, for Qui-Gon had taught him to listen to the living force, and though he had resisted, here he was, trusting not in himself, but in Qui-Gon's belief. The council, wary and divided, granted their approval, and with it Obi-Wan stepped into a role he had never expected to fill so soon, master to a Padawan, guardian to a boy whose destiny was clouded in shadows. His relationship with Anakin began not with warmth, but with solemnity. Obi-Wan cautious and stern, Anakin eager and restless. Yet beneath the surface was a bond forged in tragedy, for both had lost Qui-Gon. Both were carrying the weight of expectations they did not choose, and in that shared loss they found a fragile connection. Still, as the years stretched ahead, the events of Naboo lingered in Obi-Wan's memory, not only as the moment he became a knight, but as the moment he began to understand the true cost of being a Jedi. That triumph was often paired with grief, that victories left scars, and that every choice carried echoes into the future. The image of Darth Maul's red saber cutting into Qui-Gon replayed in his mind, reminding him always of how quickly life could be stolen. And though he had defeated the Sith, the knowledge that their order had returned gnawed at him, a warning that the galaxy's peace was fragile, that darkness had already begun to rise again. He buried these fears, carrying himself with the calm dignity expected of a Jedi Knight, yet inside he was still the boy who longed for certainty, who wanted to believe that discipline could protect the galaxy from chaos, who now shouldered not only his own doubts, but the responsibility of guiding the one child who might hold the fate of the Force itself. To the galaxy, Obi-Wan emerged from Naboo as a hero, the slayer of the Sith, the guardian of the Chosen One, but to himself he emerged as something quieter, a man marked by loss, bound by promise, and set upon a path he had never chosen, but would walk with unyielding resolve. For such was the way of Obi-Wan Kenobi, steady in the storm, loyal in the shadow, carrying duty like a burden and a blessing alike, even when it cost him everything. And so, from the tragedy of Naboo, Obi-Wan carried forward into a new chapter of his life, no longer a Padawan but a knight, no longer a student but a teacher, with the ghost of Qui-Gon's lessons guiding him still, and with the weight of Anakin Skywalker's future pressing already upon his shoulders. The promise Obi-Wan made to Qui-Gon Jinn on the floor of Naboo's palace was not an easy one to keep, for training Anakin Skywalker proved to be both his greatest duty and his greatest trial. And though he carried the title of Jedi Knight with calm dignity, inside he still bore the weight of grief and the uncertainty of stepping into a role he had not expected so soon, master to a boy who had not been raised within the temple from infancy, a boy whose strength in the Force was extraordinary, but whose passions ran deeper than anything the Order had seen in centuries. In those early days, Obi-Wan approached Anakin with discipline, teaching him the strict routines of meditation, the repetition of saber drills, the history of the Jedi, and the patience required of a Padawan. But where Obi-Wan had been eager to follow rules, Anakin bristled at them, questioning their value. Pushing against boundaries, impatient with long lessons, longing for action, and Obi-Wan, though stern, was not blind to the similarities between his Padawan and Qui-Gon, seeing in the boy the same disregard for rigid structures that had so often frustrated him in his master. And though he tried to guide Anakin toward obedience, part of him could not help but hear Qui-Gon's voice in his mind, reminding him that sometimes the code was not enough. Their bond grew slowly, forged not in effortless harmony, but in conflict and reconciliation, for Anakin often challenged Obi-Wan, pressing against his authority, and Obi-Wan, though patient, sometimes let his sternness slide into sharpness, scolding where Qui-Gon might have encouraged. Yet beneath the tension was a deep loyalty, a brotherhood disguised as mentorship, for Obi-Wan, despite his doubts, cared for the boy, seeing in him the spark of greatness even when it burned too hot. Their missions across the galaxy tested both of them, escorting diplomats through hostile territories, fending off pirates who preyed upon trade routes, investigating disputes on border worlds where blaster fire was never far away. And in each trial Anakin showed brilliance, his reflexes sharper than any Padawans, his instincts often saving lives in ways Obi-Wan could not deny. Yet with each display of power came a reminder of his recklessness, his willingness to take risks, to disobey orders if it meant saving someone. And Obi-Wan, caught between pride and concern, found himself constantly walking the line between encouragement and restraint. In quiet moments, he worried that he was failing his master's last wish, that he was too rigid where Qui-Gon had been open, that he was shaping Anakin into a reflection of himself rather than allowing him to become what the Force intended. Yet, when he looked at the boy's eager smile or listened to his passionate dreams of freeing slaves and ending injustice, he also felt a warmth he had not expected, a sense of companionship that filled the hollow left by Qui-Gon's death. The Council watched closely, some voicing doubts about Anakin's age and his attachments, and Obi-Wan defended his apprentice with calm conviction, though inside he carried the same concerns, always fearing that the boy's emotions, his fierce love for his mother, his anger at injustice, were cracks that discipline alone could not mend. Still, year by year, master and apprentice grew together, Obi-Wan tempering Anakin's wildness, Anakin pulling Obi-Wan into risks he might never have taken alone, their bond deepening not only as Jedi, but as brothers in arms, brothers in loss, brothers in destiny. For Obi-Wan, training Anakin was never simple, never easy. But it became the center of his life, the promise that shaped his every decision, the duty that would define him forever. And though he could not see it yet, every lesson, every argument, every mission was weaving them into a bond so strong it would one day tear his heart in two. As the years of apprenticeship unfolded, the relationship between Obi-Wan and Anakin deepened into something layered and difficult, full of tension yet also filled with a bond neither could deny. For though their days were often marked by arguments over rules, strategy, and obedience, there was also laughter in quiet moments, shared triumphs on missions, and the unspoken closeness of two souls walking the same path through storms. Obi-Wan, who had once feared he would fail Qui-Gon's last wish, found himself slowly admiring the courage in his Padawan, the way Anakin would throw himself into danger to save others, the way his heart seemed incapable of letting go of anyone in need, even if it meant breaking orders, And though Obi-Wan would scold him sharply afterward, deep down he knew there was nobility in it, a nobility that reminded him of Qui-Gon's willingness to defy the Council when compassion demanded it. Their travels carried them across countless worlds to frontier colonies where settlers struggled against raiders, to bustling city planets where corruption simmered beneath polished towers, to icy outposts where survival meant relying on each other in silence, and in each place Anakin grew more confident, his power in the Force astonishing even Obi-Wan, who sometimes watched in awe as his apprentice's reflexes seemed almost to bend time, as if the universe itself bent to his will. Yet with that power came frustration, for Anakin often felt constrained by the discipline Obi-Wan demanded, longing for recognition, longing for trust that he was ready for more. And Obi-Wan, cautious and protective, held him back, insisting he was not yet prepared, a dynamic that built both resentment and closeness, for Anakin needed Obi-Wan's approval even as he pushed against it. In private, Obi-Wan wrestled with his doubts, meditating late into the night, questioning whether he was shaping the boy properly, wondering if Qui-Gon would have been gentler, freer, more encouraging, and yet he returned each day to the same steady role. The mentor who would not waver, who would not abandon his responsibility, who would guide Anakin even when it meant enduring his anger. Their connection grew into something resembling brothers more than master and apprentice. Obi-Wan's dry wit often meeting Anakin's youthful bravado in exchanges that masked how much they cared for each other. And though Obi-Wan often spoke with sternness, there were rare moments where his voice softened, where he told Anakin that he was proud, that he trusted him, words that meant more to the boy than he ever admitted. The Council remained skeptical, voicing concerns about Anakin's impatience and his attachments, and though Obi-Wan defended his Padawan fiercely, he could not silence the quiet echo of those warnings in his own heart, sensing that beneath Anakin's brilliance was a storm that might one day break loose. Still, he chose loyalty. He chose trust. He chose to stand beside the boy he had promised to train, and in doing so, he bound himself not only as teacher, but as family, a bond that neither prophecy nor council decree could undo. And so the years of training shaped them both, Anakin growing into a Jedi of unmatched skill, Obi-Wan into a master tempered by patience, their paths braided together until it was impossible to speak of one without the other. And though neither could see where that road would end, they walked it with the unspoken certainty that their lives were forever intertwined. Master and apprentice, brothers and comrades, bound by a promise whispered on a dying master's lips. As their years together drew closer to the fateful time of galactic conflict, Obi-Wan came to see that training Anakin was not simply about teaching him the techniques of the Jedi, but about walking beside him through the growing pains of youth, power, and responsibility, a path that demanded as much patience as it did authority. There were moments when Obi-Wan's stern corrections seemed to push Anakin away, the boy bristling under lectures about caution, humility, and restraint. Yet just as often there were moments when Anakin's admiration shone through, when he looked to his master not as a jailer of his freedom, but as the steady figure who had never abandoned him, who had been there since the death of Qui-Gon, and who carried the weight of believing in him when others doubted. In small missions where they protected senators or escorted supply convoys, their bond was visible in the way they moved together. Obi-Wan holding the line with patience, Anakin darting forward with energy, the two complementing one another like balance made flesh. And though their arguments never ceased, they also never shattered the loyalty that bound them. At times, Obi-Wan wondered if his role was less about shaping Anakin into the perfect Jedi, and more about simply keeping him safe long enough for destiny to reveal its hand. For the boy's power was undeniable, his presence in the Force like a rising sun. And Obi-Wan knew in his heart that no amount of discipline could change the fact that Anakin was different, chosen, and destined for greatness or ruin. This knowledge did not make the task easier, but it did remind him that his duty was not about molding Anakin into himself, but about giving him the tools to survive the storm he was bound to face. By the time whispers of war began to stir and the galaxy edged toward crisis, Anakin was no longer the wide-eyed boy from Tatooine, but a young man of skill and confidence, eager to prove himself to the galaxy, and Obi-Wan, watching him grow, felt both pride and fear. For though the Padawan's strength filled him with awe, the shadows of attachment and ambition were never far away. Still, for every doubt, there was a moment of quiet reassurance, a smile exchanged after a successful mission, a word of gratitude offered in rare vulnerability, a laugh shared in the cockpit of a starship drifting between stars. These small fragments, more than the arguments or lessons, were the heart of their relationship, reminders that beneath the roles of master and apprentice, they had become family. And so, as their training years reached their end, Obi-Wan stood ready to guide Anakin into the wider galaxy, aware that the boy's journey would surpass anything he could imagine, yet resolved to walk beside him for as long as he could, honoring Qui-Gon's final wish not just out of duty, but out of love. For Anakin had become far more than a responsibility. He had become Obi-Wan's greatest bond, his greatest pride, and ultimately, his greatest sorrow. The galaxy shifted forever with the Battle of Geonosis, and for Obi-Wan Kenobi, it was the moment when the quiet struggles of mentorship gave way to the storm of war. A storm that would consume the Jedi and redefine their purpose. For where once they had been guardians of peace, suddenly they were generals, commanders of armies bred in secret, soldiers who looked to them for guidance in battles that stretched across countless systems. It began with the desperate rescue on Geonosis itself. Obi-Wan captured while investigating the Separatists, Anakin and Padme risking everything to save him, and the three of them surrounded in the execution arena, fighting side by side against beasts and droids until the Jedi Order, united, descended in force, sabers flashing in a spectacle of courage, only to find themselves outnumbered and pressed to the brink, saved only by the arrival of Master Yoda with the Grand Army of the Republic at his back. Ranks of clone troopers sweeping into battle in a revelation that stunned even the Jedi, for none had known such an army existed. None had imagined they would one day lead soldiers into war. For Obi-Wan, the sight of thousands of identical faces fighting under his command was a moment of unease and necessity. For though he had not asked for this responsibility, he took it upon himself with the same steadiness that defined his life, stepping into the role of general not with ambition, but with duty, determined to lead with honor and to preserve life where he could. From that day forward, he was no longer simply a Jedi Knight or a teacher to Anakin. He was General Kenobi, a strategist, a negotiator, and a symbol of calm for soldiers bred to fight. His presence on the front lines a reassurance that discipline and compassion still had a place even in war. Campaign after campaign carried him to the farthest edges of the galaxy. Sieges on desolate worlds where dust choked the air. Ambushes in tangled jungles where droids lurked in the shadows. Assaults in the icy void of space where starships clashed in blinding light. And always, Obi-Wan led not with reckless charge, but with careful planning, preferring diplomacy where possible, negotiation when offered, and battle only when no other choice remained. He earned a reputation among allies and enemies alike as the negotiator, a man whose first weapon was not his saber, but his words. Though when battle came, he wielded both with the same unyielding patience. At his side, Anakin grew into a warrior of unmatched boldness, their bond now tested in fire, their arguments often flaring, but their trust unshaken, for on the battlefield they complemented each other as they always had. Obi-Wan steady and methodical, Anakin daring and unpredictable, their strengths combining to carve victories where defeat seemed certain. Yet, beneath the victories was a growing unease, for Obi-Wan saw what war was doing to the Order Jedi who had once meditated in peace, now wearing armor. Jedi who had sworn to defend life, now directing campaigns where soldiers and civilians alike fell in countless numbers. And though he carried the burden with dignity, he could not silence the quiet voice within that wondered if this was the path the Jedi were meant to walk. Still, he did not waver, for the Republic needed him, his soldiers needed him, and Anakin needed him. And so Obi-Wan buried his doubts beneath the mantle of command, holding himself steady as the galaxy unraveled around him. In long campaigns, he shared meals with clone officers, learning their names, their quirks, treating them not as tools of war, but as men with lives and individuality, a rare kindness that earned their loyalty. For though they were bred for obedience, Obi-Wan gave them respect, and in return, they gave him trust. The Clone Wars had begun, and with them Obi-Wan's life entered a chapter of endless movement, endless sacrifice, endless battle. Yet through it all he remained what he had always been, the steady flame in the storm, the negotiator in the chaos, the Jedi who carried the weight of leadership not for glory, but for duty, guiding the galaxy through its darkest hours, even as he wondered silently if this war was already the end of everything he had sworn to protect. In the months that followed Geonosis, the galaxy became a battlefield without end, and Obi-Wan Kenobi found himself drawn into campaign after campaign, the quiet meditations of the temple replaced by the constant rumble of gunships, the chatter of clone troopers, and the endless hum of war machines stretching from one star system to the next. He adapted not by choice, but by necessity, learning quickly that leadership in war required more than strategy. It required presence, compassion, and resilience. For the clones under his command were not faceless soldiers to him, but living beings bred for duty. And Obi-Wan, unlike some of his peers, took the time to know them, to call them by name, to offer respect where others offered only orders, and this simple humanity made him beloved among the men who followed him, especially Commander Cody, his second in command, whose loyalty to Obi-Wan was forged not only in shared victories, but in mutual respect. Together, they led forces across theaters of war that tested every skill Obi-Wan possessed. From the siege of Christophsis, where his patience outmaneuvered separatist generals, to the shadowed corridors of Umbara, where trust in his soldiers was the only light in a campaign drenched in deception. Yet even as victories piled up, Obi-Wan felt the strain of what war was doing to the Jedi Order. For every day brought new reports of fallen comrades, knights and Padawans alike cut down in service of a republic that seemed increasingly consumed by politics and corruption. And though he tried to bury his doubts, there were nights in his command tent when he sat staring at star charts and casualty lists, wondering if this was the destiny of the Jedi to be generals rather than guardians. commanders rather than keepers of peace. He carried those doubts quietly, never letting them weaken his resolve, for he knew the men around him looked to him for steadiness. And if he faltered, they too would falter. With Anakin at his side, their partnership evolved into something more like equals. Obi-Wan still the cautious voice, but no longer speaking only as master to apprentice, for Anakin had become a leader in his own right, daring, bold, and reckless, often diving headlong into danger, where Obi-Wan would have counseled patience, and yet somehow turning that recklessness into victory. And though Obi-Wan often scolded him for disobedience, he also marveled at the way Anakin inspired others, the way his bravery ignited hope in soldiers weary of endless battle. Their dynamic became legendary, the calm negotiator and the fearless warrior, and together they won battles that would be remembered in songs and records long after. Still, Obi-Wan knew the cost of these victories. For every world liberated was another scar carved into the Order, another reminder that peace had slipped further away, and though he told himself they fought for justice, he could not silence the whisper that perhaps they were playing into the hands of a shadow none of them could yet see. On Mandalore, he saw how war twisted politics and love alike, his bond with Duchess Satine a painful reminder of what he had given up, of what he continued to sacrifice. And though he buried his feelings beneath the discipline of the Jedi, her presence and her ideals haunted him, shaping his understanding of what was truly at stake. Through it all, Obi-Wan carried himself with calm, never raising his voice, never letting anger guide his hand. Yet inside he was weary, scarred by years of battles, scarred by losses, scarred by the endless march of war that seemed to have no end. And though he would not say it aloud, he knew that this conflict was slowly eroding the very soul of the Jedi. Still, he pressed forward, leading his men with honor, guiding Anakin with patience, negotiating when he could, fighting when he must, embodying the balance he had always sought, the balance between duty and compassion, between discipline and mercy, even as the galaxy slipped further into darkness. And though he could not know it, these were the years that would both define his legend and set the stage for the greatest heartbreak of his life. For the Clone Wars were not simply a conflict of Republic and Separatists, but the crucible in which Anakin Skywalker's fate would be sealed. And Obi-Wan's role as master, general, and friend would be tested beyond anything he could endure. Across the countless campaigns of the Clone Wars, Obi-Wan Kenobi became known not only as a Jedi general, but as the negotiator, a title spoken with respect by allies and with grudging admiration by enemies. For while others sought victory through overwhelming force, Obi-Wan often won through patience, wit, and diplomacy, wielding words with as much precision as his lightsaber. His reputation was forged in moments where others might have rushed to battle. But he paused, listening to the enemy, reading their intent, and finding a way to bend conflict toward resolution, saving lives on both sides whenever he could. And yet when diplomacy failed, his blade was steady, his strategies careful, his resolve unshaken. The clones under his command trusted him implicitly, for he treated them as men rather than tools, sharing campfires with them, speaking their names, recognizing their individuality even when their faces were identical. And this simple humanity made his forces fight with loyalty that no amount of genetic programming could produce. Commander Cody stood closest, his bond with Obi-Wan one of mutual respect. Two soldiers leading from different worlds, yet moving as one in battle. Obi-Wan's calm authority complementing Cody's efficiency, together creating a command style that saved lives and delivered victories even in the grimmest circumstances. Campaigns stretched across the galaxy, the Siege of Christophsis, where Obi-Wan's calm strategy outlasted separatist assaults, the liberation of Ryloth, where he negotiated with desperate Twi'lek leaders to unify their resistance, the tense standoff on Bothawui, where words alone held back bloodshed, and in each theater his reputation grew, Jedi and clone alike looking to him as a steady hand in the storm. Yet, for all his victories, Obi-Wan carried the contradictions of his role, for he had sworn as a Jedi to protect peace. Yet, here he was, leading armies into battles that left planets scarred and populations displaced, and though he reminded himself that the Republic must be defended, in his quiet moments of meditation, he wondered whether the Order had already strayed too far, whether the war itself was the true defeat, eroding their spirit with each campaign. Still, he pressed forward, because men looked to him for guidance, because Anakin fought beside him and needed his steadying presence, because retreat was not an option when worlds cried out for help. His diplomatic skill earned him enemies as well as allies. Separatist leaders who cursed his name, bounty hunters who sought his life, warlords who learned that no trick or bribe could sway the negotiator, and more than once he found himself in danger not from blaster fire, but from the shadows of plots aimed to remove him from the war. On Mandalore, his heart was tested in ways battle never could, for his bond with Duchess Satine reminded him of the life he might have chosen, a life of love rather than duty, and though he remained loyal to the Jedi Code, the ache of what he lost lingered, shaping the compassion that defined his leadership, reminding him always that every life mattered, that every negotiation was worth the attempt, even when the odds were slim. His confrontations with General Grievous, the separatist commander of droids, became legendary duels across burning ships, chases through collapsing cities, battles where his calm precision clashed with the monster's ferocity, each encounter a reminder that patience and wit could overcome brute force. Yet perhaps his greatest struggle was not with foes, but with the slow erosion of hope. For as the war dragged on, he saw how corruption festered in the Republic, how the Senate grew fat with politics while soldiers died on nameless worlds, how the Jedi Council grew weary and uncertain, caught between their ideals and their role as commanders. And though he remained steadfast, the doubt gnawed at him, the sense that they were being pulled into a trap none could yet see. Through it all, Obi-Wan embodied balance, a warrior who sought peace, a negotiator who fought when he must, a man who bore the mantle of general with reluctance yet with unyielding dignity, and in doing so he became not only a leader of armies, but a symbol of what the Jedi were meant to be, not conquerors, but guardians, not rulers, but servants, standing firm in the storm even as it tore the galaxy apart. The title of negotiator was not simply a name whispered across holo-news channels or battlefield reports. It was a reflection of how Obi-Wan Kenobi chose to fight in a galaxy consumed by fire, and in campaign after campaign, he showed that even in war, there was room for patience, wit, and compassion. On Christophsis, when droid legions pressed hard against the city's defenses, it was Obi-Wan who stalled the Separatist commander with endless discussions of surrender terms, buying precious hours until reinforcements arrived. His calm voice overcomes confused enemies and steadied allies, turning delay itself into a weapon. On Ryloth, when the Twi'lek resistance hesitated to trust the Republic, Obi-Wan walked among the starving civilians, speaking not as a general but as a servant, reminding them that they were not pawns but people whose freedom mattered, and in time his sincerity won them over more than blasters ever could. Even on Umbara, where the campaign became mired in deception and blood, Obi-Wan never lost sight of the individuality of his soldiers, fighting to shield them from reckless orders and to ensure that every sacrifice had meaning. His name spread far beyond the Republic lines, whispered even among separatist troops who learned to respect the Jedi General who preferred to capture rather than slaughter, to listen rather than dictate, to treat even enemies with dignity when the chance arose. Yet diplomacy did not shield him from danger, and more than once Obi-Wan found himself in duels that tested every lesson of his training. Against Count Dooku, the fallen Jedi turned Sith, he fought with patience, holding his ground while Anakin raged beside him, understanding that the only way to face such a master was not through fury, but through calm. Though more often than not, it was survival rather than victory that came of those encounters. Against General Grievous, the monster of metal and malice, Obi-Wan's blade clashed with whirling sabers in battles that shook starships and cities alike, and though he often left battered and weary, he came to embody the one truth that defined him, that defense, patience, and resolve could weather storms that brute strength could not. Yet even as he carried victory after victory, Obi-Wan bore the contradictions of his role like invisible scars. The Jedi Council sat in their chamber high above Coruscant, weary with doubt, uncertain whether the war was victory or trap, and Obi-Wan felt it too, the gnawing unease that every step forward was part of some greater design, some hidden hand pulling strings none of them could cut. He saw how the Republic Senate grew entangled in greed and corruption, how politicians traded lives for influence, how clones were sent into battles that senators never dared to witness. And in the quiet of his meditation, he asked himself if this was truly the destiny of the Jedi. Yet even with these doubts, he did not falter, because to falter would be to abandon the men who trusted him, the civilians who cried out for protection, the apprentice who still looked to him for guidance. He walked the line between Jedi and General with grace, a man who carried himself with dry wit and calm composure, never letting the weight of war crush him, though inside he was often wary to the bone. For his soldiers, his calm was a shield. For his enemies, his patience was a puzzle they could not solve. For his peers, his steadiness was a reminder of what the Jedi still stood for even in the mud of endless conflict. In every way, Obi-Wan Kenobi embodied what it meant to be the negotiator, not because he avoided battle, but because he remembered that battle was never the goal, only the last resort when every other path had failed. And so, as the Clone Wars raged on, his legend grew, not as the fiercest fighter or the boldest leader, but as the man who held firm in the chaos, who spoke when others shouted, who listened when others struck, a Jedi whose strength lay not only in his saber, but in the unyielding heart that carried him forward. Among all the campaigns and negotiations that marked the Clone Wars, none pierced Obi-Wan Kenobi's heart as deeply as those tied to Mandalore. For on that world of warriors and shifting politics lived Duchess Satine Kryze, a woman whose path had once intertwined with his own in youth, when he and Qui-Gon Jinn were assigned to protect her during a violent conflict. In those long months of hiding, danger close at hand, young Obi-Wan had felt the stirrings of love, and though he remained true to the Jedi code, a bond had formed that never faded, a bond that became the quiet secret of his heart. Years later, when duty carried him back into Satine's orbit, Obi-Wan faced a trial no battlefield could prepare him for Satine had become the leader of Mandalore, a duchess devoted to pacifism, determined to guide her people away from the endless wars of their past, while Obi-Wan had become the Republic's negotiator, a general in a galaxy drowning in conflict, and the contrast between them was as sharp as the affection they still carried in unspoken glances. Their conversations were filled with tension, Satine accusing him of hypocrisy for fighting in a war while claiming to defend peace. Obi-Wan countering with reminders that sometimes one must stand against evil to protect the innocent, and beneath the arguments lay an ache, a longing for what might have been had they chosen differently long ago. Yet Obi-Wan never faltered in his commitment to the Jedi Code, never let his feelings override his duty, though it cost him more than he admitted, for Satine was not simply a woman from his past, but the embodiment of the life he could have had, a life of love, of partnership, of freedom from the burdens the Jedi carried. Their bond was tested as Mandalore became a pawn in galactic struggle, caught between Satine's pacifist government and factions like Death Watch, warriors who longed to restore Mandalore's martial heritage. Time and again, Obi-Wan returned to aid her, not only as a Jedi, but as a man who could not abandon someone he loved, even if he would never speak the word aloud. And with each return their bond deepened, tangled in duty and affection. When Darth Maul, thought destroyed years before, returned to take vengeance on Obi-Wan, it was Satine who suffered, captured, and used as bait, her life hanging in the balance of Maul's cruelty. Obi-Wan came, as he always did, calm and unyielding, even in the face of torment, yet powerless to save her when Maul drove his blade through her before his eyes, Satine collapsing into his arms with her last breath spoken as a confession of love. A confession Obi-Wan returned not with passion, but with the quiet anguish of a man who had always known but never allowed himself to say it. That moment became one of the deepest wounds of his life, another scar carved alongside Qui-Gon's death, another lesson in the cost of duty, for in choosing the Jedi path he had lost her, and in losing her he carried yet another weight of grief into the shadows of war. Yet even then, Obi-Wan did not break, did not seek revenge, did not let hatred consume him. Though it would have been easy, though no one would have blamed him, instead he endured. He carried the pain with the same quiet strength that defined him, proving once again that his true power lay not in his blade, but in his ability to remain true to himself even when everything he loved was torn away. Satine's death haunted him, shaping his every choice that followed, reminding him always of the fragile line between love and duty, between passion and peace. And though he buried his grief beneath calm composure, those who knew him well saw the shadow in his eyes, the quiet ache of a man who had lost not only his master and his apprentice's trust, but also the woman who had shown him a different life. In Satine, Obi-Wan glimpsed the possibility of what the Jedi might have been: guardians without chains, protectors who could love without fear, and in her loss, he glimpsed the tragedy of what the Jedi had become, bound by codes that could not protect them from the cruelties of fate. Yet even burdened by this, he continued, for such was Obi-Wan's way, to endure, to stand, to carry forward. The negotiator who would never surrender, the Jedi who bore his sorrows in silence, the man who lost love, yet never lost compassion. The story of Obi-Wan and Satine did not end in a single moment of tragedy, for the shadow of Mandalore lingered long after, and in the quiet spaces of war, Obi-Wan often found himself haunted not only by her death, but by the choices that led to it, wondering if he could have saved her had he been willing to bend the code, to speak aloud what both of them already knew. And though he never let these thoughts consume him, they clung to him like scars etched into his spirit. Mandalore itself became a symbol of how the galaxy's endless conflicts twisted ideals into weapons, for Satine had fought with every breath to maintain pacifism, to keep her people free of war, yet her refusal to bend made her vulnerable to the relentless ambitions of Death Watch, a group of Mandalorian warriors who longed to restore the ancient martial traditions of their people. Time and again, Obi-Wan stood between Satine and Death Watch's plots, foiling their schemes with the patience and discipline that defined him. But even his vigilance could not hold back the tide forever. When Darth Maul returned from the shadows, broken yet burning with hatred for Obi-Wan, Mandalore became his battlefield of vengeance, and Death Watch became his pawns, their lust for power binding them to his cunning. Together they staged a coup, seizing control of Mandalore's government, capturing Satine, and luring Obi-Wan into a trap designed not simply to kill him, but to break him, to shatter his heart in a way no blade ever could. Obi-Wan, true to his nature, came without hesitation, risking everything to save her. And though he fought bravely, Maul's cruelty was sharper than any saber, for he knew the one way to wound Kenobi beyond repair. With a slow, deliberate strike, Maul murdered Satine before Obi-Wan's eyes. Her final words a confession of the love she had always carried, whispered as life slipped away in his arms. In that moment, Obi-Wan's world might have collapsed, his pain enough to drive any man to vengeance. Yet instead he endured, holding her gently as the light faded from her eyes. And when he rose again, it was not with rage, but with sorrow held quietly, refusing to give Maul the satisfaction of seeing him break. That choice defined him as much as any battle, to feel love and loss as deeply as any man, yet to rise above vengeance, to remain true to the Jedi path, even when it cost him everything. But though he refused revenge, the wound was real, and it never fully healed. In the years that followed, Satine's memory became both his burden and his strength, the reminder of what was lost, but also of what he fought for, the proof that compassion mattered even in a galaxy drowned in war. He rarely spoke of her, burying his grief beneath duty, but those who looked closely could see it in his eyes, a shadow of pain carried with grace. The fall of Mandalore, the corruption of its proud people by Death Watch and Maul, became another fracture in the galaxy, another sign that the Republic's war was consuming everything it touched. And for Obi-Wan, it was a cruel reflection of what the Jedi were enduring, ideals crumbling, bonds breaking, the future darkening. Yet even amid that darkness, Obi-Wan remained steady, his grief never turning to bitterness, his sorrow never hardening into hate. And in that steadiness he revealed his truest strength. Not the skill of his blade, not the brilliance of his strategy, but the unyielding compassion of a man who endured loss without surrendering to the shadows. To the galaxy he was still the negotiator, still the general whose calm voice could steady soldiers, and whose words could turn battles before sabers clashed. But to himself he was also a man who carried the memory of Satine with every step, a reminder that even Jedi, bound by codes, could love and lose, and that true strength was found not in denying the pain, but in carrying it without letting it consume the light within. The tragedy that would forever define Obi-Wan Kenobi's life came not from the endless battles of the Clone Wars, nor the countless scars of loss already carried, but from the fall of the one person he had sworn above all to protect. The boy he had promised to train, the friend he had come to love as a brother, Anakin Skywalker. From the earliest years of the war, Obi-Wan had watched the shadows gathering around Anakin, seen the way his temper flared when innocents were endangered, the way his attachments burned hotter than the code allowed, the way his hunger for recognition sometimes overpowered his judgment, and though he counseled patience, warned of caution, and urged humility, Anakin's path often pulled toward extremes, his victories dazzling yet always edged with a recklessness that unsettled Obi-Wan's calm. The council too saw the signs, voicing unease, and though Obi-Wan defended his apprentice time and again, a quiet fear lingered in his heart, a fear that perhaps Qui-Gon's faith had been misplaced, or worse, that he himself had failed in shaping Anakin into the Jedi he was meant to be. As the war dragged on, that fear grew, sharpened by Anakin's closeness to Chancellor Palpatine, whose words of praise and guidance seemed to fill a void that Obi-Wan's discipline could not. And though Obi-Wan trusted Palpatine as the Republic's leader, he began to see how the bond between the man and his apprentice was deeper than politics, how the Chancellor's influence was slowly shaping Anakin's trust away from the Council and toward something Obi-Wan could not fully grasp. When whispers of corruption grew louder, when the Jedi began to suspect that darkness was gathering within the very heart of the Republic, Obi-Wan found himself torn, caught between his loyalty to the Order and his love for Anakin, sensing the boy's growing resentment yet unable to bridge it fully. For every attempt to caution was met with defensiveness, every attempt to steady was met with frustration. And then the moment came, when the truth revealed itself with the cruel clarity of betrayal. Anakin Skywalker, the Chosen One, had not only doubted the Jedi, but had turned against them, seduced by Palpatine's promises of power and the dark allure of saving those he loved from death, a path that led him into the embrace of the Sith. When Obi-Wan uncovered this truth, the weight of it crushed him, for it was not simply the betrayal of an apprentice, but the loss of a brother, the collapse of everything he had poured his life into since Naboo. Every lesson, every mission, every bond unraveling in the face of the darkness Anakin had chosen. Their final confrontation on Mustafar was less a duel than a storm of grief and fury, Obi-Wan's heart breaking with every strike of his blade, his voice trembling as he begged Anakin to see reason, to return, to remember who he was, yet every plea was met with rage, with accusations, with the fiery eyes of someone lost to a shadow too deep to reach. The lava boiled around them as their sabers clashed. And though Obi-Wan fought with all the skill and discipline of a master, his strikes were heavy with sorrow, his defenses with heartbreak, for he did not fight to win, he fought to stop, to save, to hold back the tide of destiny that had already claimed his brother. But in the end, it was Obi-Wan who prevailed, disarming Anakin with a final strike that severed not only his limbs, but the bond they had shared, leaving the man he loved as family broken on the blackened shores, flames rising to consume him. Standing above the ruined body of his apprentice, Obi-Wan's voice cracked as he cried out the words that would echo forever. "You were my brother, Anakin. I loved you." And in those words was the truth of his entire life, the truth that his greatest strength and his deepest wound had always been the same person. Yet Obi-Wan, unable to deliver the final mercy, turned away, leaving Anakin to his fate, his heart heavier than it had ever been, his soul scarred with the knowledge that love and duty had collided in the cruelest way possible. From that day onward, Obi-Wan carried the shadow of Mustafar with him like a silent weight. The fall of Anakin, not only the fall of a Jedi, but the shattering of his own spirit. The moment when everything he had built crumbled into ash, and though he would endure, though he would carry on as he always had, the echo of his brother's scream in the flames would never leave him. The battle on Mustafar was not simply a clash of blades, but a collision of hearts. A storm of love turned to anguish, and as Obi-Wan Kenobi faced Anakin Skywalker across platforms of burning metal, the fire around them seemed to mirror the fire consuming both their souls. Every strike of Anakin's saber came with fury, every movement filled with the raw strength of a man who had abandoned restraint, and Obi-Wan met each blow with the steady discipline of a master who did not wish to fight, but had no choice. His defenses calm, but his heart breaking. For in every furious assault, he still glimpsed the boy he had trained, the brother he had laughed with, the man he had trusted. Their duel carried them across narrow beams, collapsing machinery, and flowing rivers of lava, the air heavy with smoke and heat. And though to an outsider it might have seemed a battle for supremacy, to Obi-Wan it was agony, each moment a reminder that his failure had brought them here, that no matter how hard he had tried, he had not been enough to save Anakin from the shadows now blazing in his eyes. He begged him to see reason, to turn back, to remember their bond, but Anakin's voice, twisted with rage, accused Obi-Wan of betrayal, of envy, of standing in the way of his destiny. And in those words, Obi-Wan heard not truth, but the echo of Darth Sidious's poison, the insidious corruption that had hollowed out the man he loved. As the duel reached its peak, both warriors exhausted yet unyielding, Obi-Wan found himself on higher ground, a moment of advantage, and with a voice heavy with sorrow, he warned Anakin not to try it, to stand down, to stop before it was too late. But Anakin, consumed by pride and fury, leapt, and in that instant Obi-Wan made the strike that severed him from victory and from the life they had shared. His saber cutting through in a motion he wished he could take back, even as he knew it was the only way to end the madness. Anakin fell, broken and screaming, the fire of Mustafar licking at his body, and Obi-Wan, standing above, felt no triumph, only devastation, the weight of failure crushing him in a way no battle ever had. He cried out, voice breaking, confessing the truth of his love for Anakin, confessing the bond that had defined his life, and yet even as the words left his lips, he turned away, unable to finish what he had started, leaving Anakin alive, but ruined, a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his days. Gathering Anakin's lightsaber, he carried it with trembling hands, not as a trophy, but as a relic of a man lost, a promise of hope perhaps left in the child Anakin had once been. And with heavy steps he departed Mustafar, the screams of his fallen brother echoing in his ears, the fire and ash of the planet seared into his memory. The galaxy outside knew only that Darth Vader had risen and the Jedi had fallen. But for Obi-Wan, the truth was simpler and crueler. He had lost the person he loved most, the one he had sworn to guide. And in that loss he carried a sorrow so deep it would never truly heal. A sorrow that would follow him into exile, into silence, into the lonely deserts of Tatooine, where he would live not as a hero, but as a man who had seen love become hatred, who had seen a brother become an enemy, and who could never escape the fire of that final day. When Obi-Wan left the blackened shores of Mustafar, the smell of ash clinging to his robes and Anakin's saber heavy in his hand, He carried not the pride of victory, but the unbearable weight of failure. Each step away from the burning planet an act of grief, for he knew that though he had survived, he had lost far more than he had saved. In the quiet of his transport, as engines hummed and the stars stretched into hyperspace, his mind replayed every moment the clash of sabers, the rage in Anakin's voice, the final leap that sealed their fate, and in each memory he felt the sting of helplessness, the crushing realization that no word, no plea, no lesson had been enough to keep his brother from falling. He thought of Qui-Gon, of the promise he had made to train the boy, of the faith his master had placed in him, and it twisted like a knife, for what had once felt like honor now seemed like betrayal, a vow fulfilled only in tragedy. The council had warned of danger. Yoda had spoken of fear leading to the dark side, yet Obi-Wan had believed, had trusted, had loved Anakin enough to blind himself to the shadows creeping ever closer, and now those shadows had consumed everything. Holding Anakin's saber, he whispered no words, for none would come, only silence and the slow, steady ache of loss. The galaxy would come to know Darth Vader as a figure of fear, but for Obi-Wan, the name would never matter. It was Anakin he remembered, the boy on Tatooine who had dreamed of freedom, the apprentice who had laughed in starships, the friend who had fought beside him through years of war, the brother who had once sworn loyalty with a smile that now existed only in memory. And so, though the Republic fell and the Empire rose, though the Jedi Order burned and scattered, Obi-Wan's world shrank to a single truth, that he had loved Anakin Skywalker, and in losing him, he had lost a part of himself, a wound that exile and silence could never truly heal. When the fires of Mustafar faded and the Republic collapsed into the shadow of the Empire, Obi-Wan Kenobi's life was no longer that of a general, no longer that of a knight, but of a hermit cast into exile, carrying the weight of failure and the fragile ember of hope into the barren sands of Tatooine. The decision was made in the aftermath of Order 66, when the Jedi were hunted and slain, their temples burned and their names cursed. And in those final moments of chaos, Obi-Wan took upon himself a duty unlike any he had known before, not to lead armies, not to train apprentices, but to watch over a single child, Luke Skywalker, the son of Anakin and Padme, the last hope for the future. With Yoda retreating into solitude and Bail Organa carrying Leia to Alderaan, Obi-Wan carried Luke into the care of Owen and Berulaz, the boy's uncle and aunt, simple moisture farmers who wanted nothing of Jedi destinies. And there, on the edge of the Dune Sea, he swore to remain, to watch from afar, to protect the boy even if Luke never knew his name. So began the long years of silence, years in which the warrior who had once commanded fleets now walked alone among the dunes, living in a small hut carved into the rock, his saber hidden, his voice rarely heard, his presence a whisper in the desert winds. Life on Tatooine was harsh, the suns merciless, the sands endless, and the people weary, yet Obi-Wan adapted, blending into the anonymity of the settlers, becoming known simply as Ben, a strange hermit who kept to himself, sometimes seen in the marketplace, sometimes vanishing for months into the wilderness. To the galaxy at large, Obi-Wan Kenobi was dead, a casualty of the Purge. But in truth, he lived quietly, haunted by memories of Anakin's fall, of Satine's death, of the Order's ruin, his nights filled with dreams of fire and screams, his days filled with the lonely vigil of watching a boy grow from a distance. Yet even in exile, he did not abandon his discipline. He meditated daily, communed with the Force, sought to quiet his grief and guilt. And in time, through long solitude, he began to hear faint whispers of Qui-Gon, the master who had once guided him, now reaching out from beyond, teaching him to endure, to learn that even in failure there was still purpose. On rare occasions, Obi-Wan intervened when danger threatened a band of Tusken raiders too close to the Law's homestead, a gang of smugglers preying on villagers always swift, always unseen, never leaving evidence that the Jedi still walked the sands, for secrecy was the shield that kept Luke safe. He came to know the land as few others did, the shifting dunes, the hidden paths, the voices of traders in Mos Eisley, the cry of Banthas at dusk, and though it was far from the shining halls of Coruscant, this desolate world became his penance and his sanctuary alike. Yet exile was not peace, for his heart remained heavy with loss, his mind often drawn back to the flames of Mustafar, to the words spoken on Satine's lips, to the faces of comrades who would never rise again. And still, through it all, he endured, for endurance was all he had left, endurance and the quiet hope that one day the boy he watched from afar would rise to fulfill the destiny that had broken so many before him. In those long, silent years, Obi-Wan Kenobi became not the general, not the negotiator, not even the Jedi Knight he once was, but simply Ben, a man who lived in the desert, a man who carried sorrow like a shadow, a man who waited for the future with patience unshaken, guarding the flame of hope in the quietest of ways, unseen, unthanked, but unwavering, for that was the last role left to him in the galaxy, and he bore it with the same dignity that had defined him from the beginning. The years of exile stretched endlessly, each season of Tatooine marked not by galactic events, but by the rhythm of its twin suns, the howling of desert winds, and the slow growth of the boy Obi-Wan watched from afar. And in that stillness, he came to understand the weight of silence more than he ever had as a Jedi general. He kept his distance from Luke, respecting Owen Law's wishes, for Owen saw only danger in Obi-Wan's presence, a reminder of the wars and tragedies that had claimed Anakin. And though their exchanges were few, they were sharp, Owen insisting that Luke needed nothing of the Jedi, only a simple farmer's life, while Obi-Wan, with quiet resolve, reminded him that the boy carried a destiny greater than moisture farming, a truth that created tension between them, but also a fragile respect, for both men loved Luke in their own way, one as family, the other as guardian. In solitude, Obi-Wan lived simply gathering water from moisture vaporators, hunting for food in the canyons, trading sparingly in Mos Eisley for supplies, and though many settlers found him strange, calling him Old Ben, most dismissed him as a harmless hermit, never suspecting the truth of the warrior hiding behind tired eyes. Yet the desert was not without danger, and Obi-Wan could not always remain hidden. More than once, Tusken raiders prowled too close to the Law's homestead, and with quiet efficiency he drove them away, never killing when it could be avoided, using fear and precision rather than slaughter. For he knew the boy must never see the Jedi hand shielding him from afar. Smugglers and bounty hunters too passed through Tatooine's endless wastes, and on one occasion Obi-Wan crossed paths with men who had recognized the name Kenobi, survivors of a war that still whispered in the darker corners of the galaxy, and though he dispatched them with ease, the encounter left him shaken, reminded that his exile was always fragile, that discovery could undo everything. Yet it was not only the threats of the desert that shaped his years, but the quiet within himself, the endless meditations in which he sought to reconcile his failures, to forgive himself for Anakin, for Satine, for the fall of the Jedi. Slowly, faintly, through the stillness of the Force, he began to hear whispers the voice of Qui-Gon Jinn, distant yet patient, guiding him not in battle but in healing, teaching him that exile was not punishment but preparation, that the living Force was not bound to temples or councils, but was present even in the shifting sands of a barren world. These lessons humbled Obi-Wan, softened the edges of his sorrow, and in time gave him strength not through action but through endurance. Still, he often walked the desert at dusk, cloak billowing in the dry wind, gazing at the horizon where Luke might be playing in the distance. And in those moments he felt the ache of all he had lost, but also the fragile ember of all he still protected. He had lost his brother, his master, his love, his order, yet he had not lost hope, for hope was now a boy growing under twin suns. And for that hope, Obi-Wan Kenobi endured year after year, nameless, voiceless, unseen, a lone figure in the wilderness who carried the weight of the galaxy not through triumph, but through quiet sacrifice, waiting for the day when the Force would call again. As the years slipped by, Obi-Wan Kenobi's life became a pattern of silence, a rhythm carved not from battle, but from waiting, each day a small act of endurance, each night a vigil carried in solitude. He was no longer the general who had commanded armies, or the knight who had stood before councils. He was Ben, a quiet figure in the desert, known to few and trusted by fewer, yet always present, always watching, always listening for the faintest ripple in the Force that might threaten the boy. From afar he saw Luke grow from a curious child into a restless youth, and though he longed to guide him, to offer the lessons that once flowed from master to apprentice, he held himself back, knowing the time was not yet right, knowing the boy needed to live freely before the weight of destiny pressed upon him. In moments of danger, Obi-Wan intervened like a ghost, a Tusken raider frightened away by an otherworldly cry, a gang of thieves who found their blasters mysteriously useless, a storm that seemed to shift at just the right moment, never revealing himself, never leaving evidence, for secrecy was the shield that kept the boy safe. Yet exile was not without its temptations. There were nights when Obi-Wan looked to the stars and thought of Satine, of Anakin, of the Jedi who had been his family, and wondered if it might have been easier to let go, to surrender, to fade into nothingness. But he did not, for within him burned a quiet flame, fragile yet steady. The same flame he had carried from battlefield to battlefield, hope. Tatooine was not his prison but his purpose, and in its harsh deserts he found the discipline to endure, to wait, to prepare. To those who passed him on the streets of Mos Eisley, he was only a strange old man with tired eyes. But in truth, he was the last watchman of a galaxy's future, a guardian who sacrificed his life for the chance that one day, when the time was right, the son of Anakin Skywalker would rise to bring balance to the Force. And so Obi-Wan remained, patient as the sands, steady as the suns, carrying sorrow and hope together in silence, waiting for the call that he knew, deep in his heart, would one day come. Though Obi-Wan Kenobi lived as a hermit in the deserts of Tatooine, his true purpose in exile was not solitude, but guardianship, for every day of his long vigil was shaped by the quiet, unspoken promise to protect Luke Skywalker, the boy who represented both the galaxy's last hope and the most fragile ember of redemption for the man Obi-Wan had lost. To Owen and Beru Laws, Obi-Wan was an unwanted shadow, a dangerous reminder of the wars and the Jedi, and Owen in particular carried bitterness, seeing only the destruction Anakin had brought, and fearing that Obi-Wan would drag Luke down the same path. Yet despite Owen's suspicion, Obi-Wan kept his vow, watching the boy from afar, sometimes glimpsing him racing across the dunes in a skyhopper, sometimes seeing him stare at the twin suns with the same longing that had once burned in Anakin's eyes. In those moments, Obi-Wan felt both joy and sorrow. Joy at the innocence still preserved, sorrow at the destiny that waited beyond those horizons. He never revealed himself fully, never pressed into Luke's life, but his presence lingered like a silent guardian, and when danger threatened, he acted with swift precision, erasing his tracks so the boy never knew how close the shadows had come. Tusken raiders who ventured too near were scattered by the sudden cry of a krayt dragon echoing through the canyons, a sound conjured by Obi-Wan's mastery of the Force. Bounty hunters sent by whispers of surviving Sith found themselves lost in desert storms, guided away by unseen hands. Petty criminals who preyed upon moisture farmers felt an unseen fear press upon them until they fled. Each intervention was hidden, subtle, for Obi-Wan understood that Luke must grow unaware of the weight upon his shoulders, that only in ignorance could he remain free until the time came to choose his path. Yet protecting Luke was not only about warding off threats, it was also about preserving hope within himself. For in the boy's smile, his laughter carried on the wind, Obi-Wan saw a reflection of Anakin before the fall, and though the memory cut deep, it also reminded him why he endured, why he bore the silence and the loneliness of exile. In the stillness of night, Obi-Wan would meditate under the stars, often reaching out to the lingering presence of Qui-Gon Jinn, and through those quiet communions he found reassurance that his duty was not in vain, that though the galaxy had crumbled into empire, the Force had not abandoned them, and that Luke's future remained a thread unbroken. Over time, tales spread in Mos Eisley of a strange old hermit who frightened off raiders, who spoke little but whose eyes seemed to hold endless knowledge, and though most dismissed them as desert stories, Obi-Wan knew that his anonymity was a shield that could not last forever. Still, he did not waver, for his role was clear. He was not there to fight wars or to lead armies, but to guard a single life, to ensure that when the time came, Luke Skywalker would rise unbroken. And so Obi-Wan Kenobi, once a general of the Republic and a Jedi Knight of renown, lived humbly as Ben, a silent protector whose greatest battle was fought not with blades, but with patience, watching a boy grow under twin suns, holding back the darkness with nothing more than endurance, love, and the fragile hope that this child would succeed where his father had fallen. The guardianship of Luke Skywalker was not a single act of heroism, but 1,000 small decisions taken in silence, and Obi-Wan Kenobi learned that the hardest part of protecting a life was not facing danger, but accepting invisibility, the choice to remain unknown so the child could grow without the burden of legend. Day by day, year by year, Benas the desert knew him, moved like a faint breeze along the edges of Luke's world, careful not to leave prints in the sand, careful not to let a farmer's morning gossip become a rumor sharp enough to reach Imperial ears. When the heat was worst and water was low, he bartered quietly through intermediaries, a sack of filters appearing near the Lars homestead, with no signature but a neatly folded scrap of cloth. When Owen's temper flared at the sight of him on a distant ridge, Ben only bowed and withdrew, because he understood that Owen's anger was not cruelty, but fear. Fear that the galaxy, which had already stolen so much, would one day arrive at their door in white armor and take the boy as payment for a debt no one had the right to collect. Obi-Wan could not take that fear away, so he bore it with him, the way he bore so many weights, and turned it into vigilance. In Mos Eisley, he learned the rhythms of the underworld, the times smugglers favored, the cantinas where stormtroopers were laziest, the traders who could be trusted to keep quiet, and he salted his path with forgetfulness, a gentle nudge of the Force here, a distraction there, so that when people tried to recall the old man with the thoughtful eyes, their memories slipped like water through tired hands. Yet there were nights when subtlety failed, and shadows sharpened into threats. A pair of hunters once arrived with a grainy hollow-still of a Jedi, a younger man with trimmed beard and robes unmarred by sand, asking questions with voices too level to be honest. Obi-Wan listened from a neighboring booth as they showed the image to a barkeep, and in the reflection of a cracked bottle, he watched their hands settle near their blasters like men rehearsing for a quick draw they meant to win. He did not rise to meet them. Instead, he paid his bill, stepped into the alley, and let the Force unfurl like a patient tide. A gust kicked grit into their eyes just as a troupe of off-world performers paraded past, cymbals crashing, cloth banners snapping, and by the time the hunters blinked away the dust, the alley was empty and the old man forgotten, their memory smudged by a suggestion that the face in the still was too clean, too core world to be anyone from this place. They left at dusk, cursing the planet and its sand, never knowing their quarry had walked within arm's length. Not every danger wore a blaster. Tuskens had their own rights, and to some of them the Lars Moisture Farm was an offense to old claims carved by wind and hoof. When their scouts gathered on the dune line at twilight, 7 ragged silhouettes against a copper sky, Ben climbed a rocky spine above them and shaped his breath into the voice of a great dragon, a rolling ancient roar that turned the air cold. The raiders broke like a school of fish beneath a shadow, sprinting back into the wadi, leaving only a scattering of footprints that night wind erased. He did not feel triumph then, only relief and a quiet wish that the desert might teach mercy to all who crossed it. There were, too, the fragile joys of watching from afar. He saw Luke's first success at the Vaporators, the boy's shout of delight rising like a lark. He saw him race a skyhopper close enough to the ground to rake its belly with dust, reckless and laughing, and felt his heart leap into his throat with the helpless love of a parent who must let the child skim the edge to learn where edges live. On evenings when the sun set clean and the sky burned pink, Luke would climb a ridge and stare into distances too big for a boy his age, and Obi-Wan would sit on his own far rise and do the same. The two of them bound by a horizon neither yet understood. Sometimes, in the hush, he whispered to Qui-Gon, and in those whispers learned the art that had saved him, to hold grief without letting it drown the good that remained. Through such lessons he discovered that protecting Luke meant guarding not only the boy's body, but the fragile field around him where dreams grow, a patch of ground that must be kept free of cynicism and despair. The Empire did not always stomp loudly. Sometimes it pressed gently until people learned to betray themselves. So Obi-Wan stood watch for the soft pressures, new tariffs that would bankrupt moisture families, an imperial inspector whose curiosity ran too hot, a local boss who began asking why the Lars homestead of all places never seemed to suffer the worst of Tusken raids. In those cases, Ben became a rumor of misfortune following anyone who pried. The boss's skiffs inexplicably lost fuel. The inspector found forged orders reassigning him to a distant posting. The tariff envoy spent one sleepless week convinced a womp rat had nested in his walls. None of it cruel, none of it permanent, but each enough to nudge greedy attention elsewhere. Owen never said thank you. Obi-Wan never expected him to. Their rare conversations were hard sand against gentler stone. "Stay away from him," Owen would say, jaw clenched. And Ben, half bent with years that were more spirit than bone, would answer, "I am away, Owen. I am only where danger might be." Then he would step back into the wind, letting the man keep his dignity, because dignity is its own kind of shield, and shields were precious on Tatooine. With Beru, it was different. A kindness in her eyes that did not mistake gentleness for weakness. Once in the market, their paths crossed at a stall where fruit too bright to be honest gleamed in peeling crates. "Hard season," Beru said, not looking at him. "Harder coming," he replied, and slid a few credits forward without moving his hand. The whisper of the Force laying them where she would not notice until she returned home. She found them later and said nothing. Gratitude, like guardianship, often lives best unspoken. Stormtroopers came more often as the years turned, white panes of armor reflecting twin suns like knives. They asked about smugglers, about droids, about old tales of wizards who once waved their hands and changed the world. Their boots crushed lizards and hope alike, but they were men behind masks, sometimes boys, and Obi-Wan felt no hate for them, only a profound, tired pity and a carefulness sharpened by experience. When patrols grew curious about the hermit's hut, he let the wind undo his footprints and the desert swallow signs of fire. He learned to sleep lightly enough to hear a beetle turn and kept his saber wrapped in cloth that smelled of dried thyme and old leather, a comfort and a warning both. He almost never drew it. The blade had been a line between peace and war. Now the line was patience. Yet the galaxy's story still pressed on the edges of this quiet life, and sometimes Ben had to steady it with both hands. A slaver crew once came for a settlement too near the Jundland wastes, and before dawn, 3 of their speeders sat in a gully with their couplings mysteriously fused. By noon, the slavers were on foot, arguing about bad maintenance and worse luck, while the settlement woke to find a scatter of heavy bolts on its doorstep and the distant glint of someone walking away along a ridge. A child waved. The figure did not turn, but he lifted a hand at his side, and the child went back inside with a story he'd tell for the rest of his long life. In all of this, Obi-Wan's greatest task was inward, to make peace with the shape of waiting. He had been a man of action, and action can become a kind of comfort. Now restraint was his practice. When guilt rose like heat mirage, memories of Mustafar, of Satine's final breath, he breathed and let the Force pass through the ache the way wind passes through chimes, sounding truth instead of noise. Qui-Gon's presence grew clearer, not a voice exactly, but a companionship that turned empty rooms into places of prayer. "You are not nothing," the companionship seemed to say, an answer to the fear that anonymity means failure. "You are the ground from which something will grow." In that assurance, Obi-Wan found himself noticing small beauties he would have missed before. The way dawn painted the dune sea in silvers and peach, the way banthas huddled to shield their calves when wind shifted, the way Luke on a certain spring chose to help a neighbor patch a roof before racing his skyhopper because the neighbor had coughed twice and tried to hide it. Such moments were proofs of a future he could not yet see, a future that required him to do the least glamorous thing of all: endure. There were, inevitably, close calls. Once, a robed off-worlder with a saber-shaped silhouette beneath his cloak came to the cantina and asked for Kenobi by name. The room went still as a lizard under a hawk. Ben watched from a shadowed corner and weighed all the versions of disaster. Then the man's hand brushed his cloak and came away wet with spilled ale. The saber's outline softened into nothing but a bundle of pipes. The off-worlder blinked, suddenly unsure what had brought him here, and left before sunset. It was a small miracle, the kind that looks like clumsiness. Obi-Wan understood. The Force often prefers the ordinary. Another time, whispers reached him that a bureaucrat from Mos Espa kept odd books, lists of children born within a certain window, names with unusual midichlorian counts recorded by a device that should have been illegal. Obi-Wan walked all night to the clerk's door and left a pouch of credits and a forged transfer order and a sealed note that read only, "These records are cursed accounts. Burn them to save your soul." The next week, the clerk resigned, married an honest woman, and opened a stall selling kettle bread. Sometimes salvation wears flour. Through it all, Owen aged, Beru's hair silvered at the temples, and Luke lengthened into his father's height and his mother's gaze. The boy's restlessness sharpened, and with it, Owen's worry. "He's got too much of his father in him," Owen would mutter to Beru at dusk. "That's what I'm afraid of." And from a distant ridge, Ben would close his eyes and answer in silence. "He has his mother, too. He has your steadiness. He has the galaxy's need." There were days Obi-Wan ached to step forward, to place a training remote's hum in the boy's hands and say, listen to what you already are. But he waited because timing is a kind of truth. When the first rumors of rebel cells reached even Tatooine, whispers carried by freighter pilots with nervous laughs, Obi-Wan felt the Force shift, like wind before a change in weather. A storm was coming that was not made of sand. He cleaned his hut with a care bordering on ritual, buried a small box of holocrons beneath a flat stone, repaired a fraying cloak, and sat for a long time with a blue-handled saber across his knees. It belonged to a boy long gone. It belonged to a man not yet arrived. He wrapped it and set it where his hand could find it in the dark. Protecting Luke had always meant more than keeping him alive. It meant carrying forward the possibility of light when darkness insists the story is already over. And so Ben watched and waited and tended to the tiny, constant tasks that keep hope breathing. A warning left in a moisture collector's logbook, a med pack quietly replaced in a neighbor's kit, a rumor steered away from the law's name with the smallest tilt of the Force. If anyone had asked him whether it was enough, he would have smiled that dry desert smile and said enough is what keeps the door unlocked for tomorrow. On the night before the next great chapter began, he climbed his familiar ridge, and watched the twin suns drag gold over the bone-white flats. Somewhere beyond the horizon, a princess would soon send a message. Somewhere under a low roof, a boy would soon stumble into a destiny his guardians had both feared and prepared for. Obi-Wan felt the old ache and the new peace braided together in his chest. He lifted his hand as if to bless the distance, then let it fall. The desert exhaled, dawn widened, and the watchman of Tatooine, who had fought his longest battle in silence, rose to meet the day he had been waiting for. The long years of silence on Tatooine ended not with a whisper, but with a call for help carried across the stars, a message encoded in the tiny frame of a droid and destined for the one man who had waited patiently for such a summons, Obi-Wan Kenobi. When R2-D2 rolled into his hut, projecting the flickering image of Princess Leia Organa pleading for General Kenobi's aid, it was as if the Force itself had stirred awake the past, unsealing the doors of exile and reminding him that his vigil was not meant to last forever. He saw in Leia's words the same fire that had once burned in Padme, and though grief pressed at his heart, he also felt the first breath of hope he had known in years. Soon after, fate placed Luke Skywalker at his side, the boy grown restless and curious, carrying within him the same mixture of impatience and goodness that Obi-Wan had once seen in Anakin. When Obi-Wan revealed to Luke the saber that had once belonged to his father, he did so with solemnity, for in handing over the weapon he was passing more than a blade, he was passing a legacy, a responsibility, and the first step of a journey that could either save the galaxy or repeat its deepest tragedy. The old Jedi guided Luke with patience, his tone gentle but firm, speaking of the Force not as doctrine but as a living current, urging him to trust his instincts, to feel rather than to see. Together with companions drawn by circumstance, Han Solo, brash yet resourceful, and Chewbacca, loyal and fierce, they carried Leia's message into the heart of rebellion, their path winding inevitably toward confrontation with the Empire. For Obi-Wan, the journey aboard the Millennium Falcon was both a return and a farewell, a reminder of his days training younglings and fighting alongside comrades, and a preparation for the sacrifice he knew was approaching. When the Falcon was captured by the Death Star, the enormity of the threat revealed itself a weapon of terror, capable of annihilating entire worlds, and yet Obi-Wan remained calm, slipping through the corridors with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent a lifetime outwitting stronger foes. His purpose was clear: disable the tractor beam, ensure the others could escape, and in doing so, draw the shadow he had been avoiding for decades. For in those cold gray halls walked Darth Vader, the remnant of Anakin Skywalker, twisted and clad in black, and Obi-Wan knew their meeting was inevitable. When their blades clashed, it wasn't the frantic storm of Mustafar, but the slow, measured rhythm of old warriors who knew one another's hearts as well as their moves, the hum of sabers echoing with memories too painful to name. Yet Obi-Wan did not fight to win, for he had already chosen his path. He fought to buy time, to show Luke the truth, to let the boy see not fear, but serenity in the face of death. And so, with a calm smile, Obi-Wan raised his blade and allowed Vader's strike to pass, his body dissolving into the Force, leaving behind only robes and the echo of a man who had endured, who had carried sorrow and hope alike, and who now became something greater than either. His sacrifice was not an ending, but a beginning. For in that moment, Luke inherited more than a weapon. He inherited the mantle of a galaxy's hope. The proof that even in the face of darkness, The light of the Jedi could not be extinguished. When Obi-Wan Kenobi allowed Darth Vader's blade to pass through him on the Death Star, his story did not end. Rather, it transformed. For the body that fell was only a shell, and the spirit that remained became part of the living force, freed at last from the limits of flesh, able to guide in ways more profound than ever before. Death was not an end, but a passage into a greater clarity, the final lesson Qui-Gon Jinn had once whispered through the currents of the Force during Obi-Wan's lonely exile on Tatooine. Now, released from the weight of bone and sorrow, Obi-Wan found himself whole yet not whole, no longer bound by time yet still tethered to the fates of those he loved. He watched Luke Skywalker's eyes widen with grief and determination as he fled the Death Star, felt the boy's spirit tremble with the shock of loss, and knew then that his sacrifice had been understood, that it had lit a spark within Luke that would grow into flame. From that moment onward, Obi-Wan was no longer master in the physical sense, but a voice in the quiet, a whisper of guidance carried on the currents of the Force. He spoke to Luke in X-Wing cockpits and on battlefields, his voice calm and steady, urging the boy to trust in instincts deeper than thought, to let go of fear, to surrender to the Force as a friend rather than a weapon. At Yavin, when Luke faced the impossible task of guiding a torpedo into a vent smaller than the eye of a needle, it was Obi-Wan's voice that returned at the final moment, telling him to let go, to use the Force, to trust in the unseen. And when Luke closed his eyes and felt the current flow through him, striking true to shatter the Death Star, Obi-Wan felt not pride but peace, the joy of knowing that his watchful patience had not been in vain, that the years of exile had indeed prepared the galaxy's hope. Yet his presence was not only for Luke, for Obi-Wan still felt the shadow of Anakin Skywalker walking as Vader, and though the sight of what his brother had become pained him, he did not turn away, for he believed still, even beyond death, that redemption was not lost, that the boy he had once trained lingered deep beneath the mask of darkness. Through the Force, Obi-Wan reached for Leia as well, sensing in her the strength and resolve of Padme, the sharpness of mind that would one day guide armies and inspire countless souls. And though she could not yet hear him as Luke did, he touched her life with silent blessings, ensuring that the twins of Anakin and Padme, separated by necessity, would walk parallel paths toward the destiny that bound them both. Beyond death, Obi-Wan's role was neither glamorous nor loud. It was steady, patient, unseen. The same virtues that had defined his life now magnified in eternity, and though he no longer carried a saber or wore the robes of a general, he carried something far greater. The eternal presence of a guardian who would never leave, who would walk alongside the Skywalkers until the final balance was restored. Obi-Wan Kenobi's life was not one of triumphs written in golden ink, but of sacrifices carried in silence, a story of endurance, loss, and quiet hope, woven through the long unraveling of the Jedi Order. From the boy taken from Stujon, to the Padawan shaped by Qui-Gon Jinn, to the general who led men through endless war, to the hermit in the desert who guarded a single child, his journey was marked not by what he gained, but by what he gave. Again and again, he surrendered the life he might have wanted, the chance of love with Satine, the closeness of brotherhood with Anakin, the honor of standing beside his fellow Jedi, and in surrendering, he discovered his truest strength, the ability to keep going when everything else fell away. He was not the loudest of heroes, nor the boldest, nor the most celebrated. He was, instead, the quiet line that held, the patient hand that steadied, the man who bore pain without turning it into anger. His duel with Anakin was not remembered by him as victory, but as heartbreak. His years on Tatooine were not lived as freedom, but as duty. Yet in every choice, he remained faithful to the vow that bound him, the vow to protect, to endure, to believe that even in the deepest night, light could be kept alive. When Luke Skywalker first looked upon the old man in the desert, he did not see the weight behind those tired eyes, nor the fire of battles long past, nor the grief hidden beneath calm words. He saw only Ben, the hermit, the strange guardian who spoke of an ancient order and of the Force. But in time, Luke would understand. He would come to know that Obi-Wan had been the bridge across which hope traveled from one age into another, the fragile link that carried the Jedi through their fall and delivered them quietly into rebirth. His sacrifice aboard the Death Star was not an ending, but the culmination of a life spent in service, a final, graceful bow that told the galaxy the Jedi were not gone, not extinguished, not defeated but transformed, ready to rise again through the next generation. In dissolving into the Force, Obi-Wan became more than a knight. He became a part of the eternal current, a whisper that would guide Luke, a presence that would stand unseen beside Leia, a reminder that even death could not silence the compassion that had defined him. The galaxy would remember many Jedi, some for their power, some for their wisdom, some for their victories, but Obi-Wan Kenobi would be remembered for his steadfastness, for being the one who endured when all else crumbled. He was the last Jedi Knight in more than name. He was the last to hold the torch of the old ways, to carry the discipline, the patience, the compassion of the Order into an age when such virtues seemed lost. And though his story was written in shadows and sacrifices, it was also written in light. For his watch over Luke gave the galaxy its new hope, and through Luke, the legacy of the Jedi lived on. As the suns of Tatooine set and rose across his long vigil, as the stars wheeled endlessly above his exile, Obi-Wan Kenobi became something rarer than a hero. He became a symbol of endurance, of faith without reward, of love carried without possession, of sorrow borne without surrender. His was not the tale of glory, but the tale of quiet greatness, of a man who lost everything and yet gave everything still. In the end, he was what he had always been, a Jedi Knight, the last of his kind, the bridge to the future, the quiet guardian who carried hope through the fire and delivered it at last into the hands of a new generation.